Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline from Knitting House Square and today I have a sock knitting tutorial for you. So what we're going to be doing in this actual video is we're going to be knitting a DK weight sock. And it's going to be customizable to perfectly fit your feet or whoever you're knitting the socks for. Now let's start with the DK portion. What that means is usually socks are knit out of what's called fingering weight or sock weight yarn. It's a really thin yarn and it's usually a blend of wool and nylon. And typically you knit this on something like a US 0 or a US 1 knitting needle. And it creates a really fine fabric and it does create great socks. The downside though is that they take a really long time to knit. So what I'm going to be showing you in this video is a DK weight version. So side by side here, you can tell this yarn's quite a bit thicker. And in terms of how much thicker it is, in the scale of yarns, there's like fingering weight. Then right in the middle here, there would be sport weight. Then there's DK. Then there's worsted. And then above that, there's a whole bunch of bulkier weights of yarn. So I'm going to be showing you with DK weight yarn. And what I mean when I say it's customizable is you can really knit this sock for anyone. And all you need to know is you need to know the different measurements of their foot. So you need to know their circumference around their foot, the length of their foot, and then how long they want the cuff. And that's really all you need. Now, once you have those measurements, the different steps I'm going to take you through is we're going to knit this cuff down to toe. So we're going to start out up here at the cuff and determine the number of stitches we need to cast on based on the measurements you have. We're going to knit the cuff and determine how long we should keep on knitting before we put in the heel. Then we're going to calculate everything we need to make a short row heel. Once the heel is complete, we're going to figure out how long to knit the foot before we start putting in the decreases. And then we're going to figure out how we should space those decreases along the toe. So that's everything I'm taking you through in this video. And I thought this would be a great video because I do have a video on Skillshare where instead of just doing DK weight yarn, I actually make this sock pattern customizable to any weight of yarn. So if you're interested in something similar where instead you want to make a custom sock out of fingering weight or worsted weight or whatever it may be sure to check my Skillshare exclusive course down in the description box below, and I'll also try and link it up in the corner of the video here. Now in this DK weight video, we're going to also be knitting a swatch. That way you make sure your gauge perfectly matches what's described in the pattern. And all the resources that we're going to have listed down below are first, I will have the written out version of this pattern available on my website. So be sure to check my website in the description box down below. I'll have different yarns that are available that are similar to mine. So this is a wool and nylon blend right here. I'll also have each one of the different video breakpoints. That way, if you want to fast forward or rewind any specific portion of the class, you have that available, and those should show up along the bottom of the screen, and they'll also be in the description box down below. I hope you enjoy the tutorial, and let's get started. Starting off with the materials I'm using for this project, first up, let's start with my knitting needles. So here I have an interchangeable knitting needle. I am using a size US 3 for this project. But I'm going to take you through all the steps you need to be able to determine if the US 3 is the correct knitting needle for you. So checking to see if you get the same gauge as me or if your socks will be too loose or too tight. So that'll be the first portion of this tutorial. And these are part of my interchangeable set. The size 3 is the smallest option here, but depending on how tight or loose your stitches are, you may need to go up to a 4 or down to a 2. Next up, I have my yarn, and I'm using a DK weight yarn for these socks. I really enjoy working with DK weight yarn, and specifically my favorite blend is a superwash nylon. So there aren't too many out there. I find a lot of them on Etsy, and that's where I found these Gabby's Knit Goodies. So I'll link to her Etsy shop down below. But this one is 75% superwash, 25% nylon. Another one that I have is Mustache Yarns. I love their self-striping yarns, and this is one of those options. So this colorway is Over the Garden Wall. And again, this one's a DK weight, and it's 75-25. And I'll also list a few other options down below if you're curious to find some of these superwash merino nylon blends in a heavier weight of yarn. Now there are a few additional materials you're going to need. First up, I recommend printing out this pattern and using a pencil and a calculator as we go through and we fill out each one of the calculations. You'll also need a tapestry needle. This is especially important for the Kitchener stitch on the toe and also to weave in any ends that you have. I recommend 2 stitch markers to be used for the heel. And then last up, a ruler and scissors. And for your ruler, if you're measuring your own foot, instead of using the measurements available online, what I would recommend you use is one of the cloth tape measures that they use for sewing. That way it's a little bit more flexible when you're trying to measure the circumference around your foot. Now what I have in front of me right here are my 3 different gauge swatches for this project. So the topmost swatch here was knit on a US 4, then I have a US 3, and then a US 2. And the US 3 knitting needle is the one I recommend for this project that you start with because that's what created what I thought was the best fabric for this sock. Now the gauge for this sock is 6 stitches per inch and then 8.5 rounds per inch. What that gives you is a nice kind of in the median between tight and stretchy. Right, you don't want your socks to be too stretchy or too loose because then they'll just be incredibly loose as you wear them and put on shoes. Now, how you want to match my gauge for that US 3 is you want to cast on 30 stitches and join in the round. Then you want to knit round after round for approximately 2 inches and cast off. Now, once you're done knitting that round and casting off, or knitting all those rounds and casting off, you want to soak that swatch in lukewarm water for about 15 minutes, roll it up in a towel, and then lay it flat to dry. Once it's dry, you want to measure what's called your gauge. So you want to hold a ruler to your work and count the number of stitches per inch and the number of rounds per inch. Now, the one that's more important for this project for us is the number of stitches per inch. The reason for that is a lot of the length measurements are just measured in inches rather than in rounds. So what's more important for us is the number of stitches you want to cast on, right? Or the circumference around the sock. So what you want to do is you want to check that number of stitches per inch. If that stitches per inch matches the 6, you're all set and you're ready to begin the project. If you have more than 6 stitches per inch, then you're working on too small of a knitting needle size and you need to increase your knitting needle size. You want to go up 1. If you have fewer than 6 stitches per inch, then you're working on too large of a knitting needle size and you want to decrease down. So you want to keep on switching around your knitting needles until you find that perfect balance and you're able to get that 6 stitches per inch. For me, that was on the US 3 knitting needle. Once you find the needle that matches the gauge, you're all ready to begin the next step, which is the cast on. Now there's 2 ways you can go about getting these measurements. So first up, if you're knitting these for yourself, I'd recommend just taking the measurements of your foot. If you're knitting these for someone else and you know their shoe size, what you can do instead is look at the pattern resources on my website. And I'll have links to a few different blogs where they talk about the standard measurements in each one of these different dimensions given someone's shoe size. So those are kind of the 2 ways you can do it. Now, if you are measuring your own foot, the first thing you want to get is going to be your foot length, and you want it to be the total length of your foot. So you want to go from the back of your heel all the way up until your furthest toe, and that'll be our foot length, and in inches, that'll be our A measurement. Then you want to take your foot circumference, and I recommend doing it around the ball of your foot. So take the circumference all the way around. That'll be what we'll label as B. And then last up, this one's more just an option that you get to choose. So how tall do you want your sock to be? And the way this measurement is going to be calculated or measured is you want to go from the bottom of your foot and then think about how far up your leg you want it to go. So including that heel portion. That'll be our C. Now once you have those measurements and after you've completed your gauge swatch, you'll be all ready to calculate the number of stitches you need to cast on. So going down to that portion in the pattern, the way the cast on number is calculated is we take the B, And that B number was our foot circumference. We're going to multiply that by 0.9. And the reason we do that is we want it to be a little bit tighter against our foot, or have what's called negative ease. That way, when you start wearing a sock and it starts stretching out, it doesn't become too loose. And then last up, we're going to multiply that number by 6, which was, from our gauge swatch, the number of stitches per inch. And once you do B times 0.9 times 6, you're going to fill out that number on the line. And that'll be the value we label as D. Now, D may not necessarily be divisible by 2, but we actually want an even number of stitches. So let's say D was 54. That's the number that came out of your calculation. If that's the case, it's already divisible by 2, so that would be my E value as well. But let's say instead the number that came out was 51. 51 is not divisible by 2, so what I want to do is I want to round it down to the nearest number divisible by 2, so my E value would be 50. So now we can begin that cast on, and the number of stitches we'd want to cast on is whatever that rounded down number is that we calculated as E. Now that we've knit our gauge swatch and we've done our calculations for the number of stitches we need to cast on, we're all ready to begin working our sock. So in this first portion of the video, I'm going to be taking you through the cast on, the ribbing, and the main sock portion up until where we reach the heel. So to start, you can use any stretchy cast on method you'd like. This one is a cuff down to toe sock. So you just want a cast on method that's going to provide a lot of stretch in this upper edge. I'm actually just going to be using the backward loop cast on, which is a nice and simple cast on method. Other ones that are great to use could be something like the long tail cast on, the German twisted cast on, any one of those different variations that provides a nice stretchy edge. And I do have comparison videos for all those different cast-ons. I'll link that video up in the corner. For the backward loop cast on, I just need a small tail. Start off with a slip knot. Put my slip knot onto one of my knitting needle points. And then I just loop the yarn around my pointer finger and slide those loops right onto my knitting needle. And I'm going to continue casting on using whatever your preferred cast on method is until I have that number of stitches we calculated. Okay, so now I have my number of stitches, and just like I showed for the swatches, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to divide my stitches in half. So slide them over to my main cord. I knit using magic loop. I'm now going to find the midpoint of my stitches. Once I find that midpoint, stretch out my work a little bit, grab onto the cord, and then slide all of my stitches up to either knitting needle point. And once I've slid them up to the knitting needle points, I just want to make sure that my work isn't twisted at all, and I have all of the cast on bumps down towards the table. So it's not twisted in this inner corner, and all of those cast on bumps for whatever type of cast on you use are going down towards your desk or your table. You also want to make sure your working yarn is coming out the knitting needle further away from you. So right now mine's actually backwards. So what I want to do is I'm going to flip my knitting needles to go the other way. Now my working yarn is coming out the back knitting needle, and I'm just going to readjust. So now it's not twisted, and all of my cast on bumps are going down towards the table. Now that we're all set up, we're ready to begin our ribbing rounds. And to begin ribbing, I start with a knit one. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my working yarn up in between my two knitting needles, then just drape it over my back knitting needle. That prevents me from accidentally starting the round with the yarn over. And now to actually start working my round, I'm going to take my back knitting needle, pull it towards the right, making sure I still have plenty of cord over here on the left-hand side. And now I'm going to go right into that first stitch on my front knitting needle as if to knit. Knit that stitch, slide it off. Now purl one, bring my yarn to the front, purl the next stitch, and I'm going to keep on working knit one, purl one all the way across this front knitting needle. Now when I finish going across this first knitting needle, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to repoint my knitting needles over towards the right, thread back in my second knitting needle. Sometimes the first stitch gets a little tight there. I want to make sure nothing's twisted. All of my work is going down towards the table, and my working yarn is coming out the back knitting needle or the one further away from me. Now, depending on if your first stitch on the other side is a knit stitch or a purl stitch, it's going to change how you hold your yarn. So if your next stitch in the knit one, purl one series is a knit stitch, you want your working yarn up in between, drape it over your back knitting needle. If it's a purl stitch, you want to leave it hanging down below. So for me, I just did a purl one, so I'm going to start with a knit one. Pull my back knitting needle, or the one with the working yarn coming out of it, towards the right, leaving plenty of cord. And now I'm going to begin working across this side. And now as I finish going across this knitting needle, again, I'm going to turn my knitting needle point over towards the right, make sure all my work is going down towards the table, and thread back in my second point. And now that I've gone across both knitting needles, I've worked one full round. So I'm going to continue working this knit one, purl one ribbing round for the length that I've determined in my pattern. So for my other sock over here, I have 2 inches just about of ribbing. So I'm going to continue working those 2 inches. Then I'll come back and I'll show you the next portion. So now I finished knitting the ribbing portion, or the cuff up here at the top. So the next portion that I'm going to be working on the sock is this portion up through where the heel begins. In order to figure out how long we need to knit that sock leg, we actually need to calculate the heel first. So first, we want to find the number of stitches that we're going to need on that heel flap. And the calculation that we have here is it says do E over 2. So E was the total number of stitches we cast on, and we want half of that. The reason we want half of that is because the heel is only worked across half of the stitches. So once we get the number of stitches that are involved in the heel, that'll be our F number. Now what we want to do is we want to take that F number and we want to divide it into as close as we can get for 3 equal sections. And this is essentially the way heels work, is you start decreasing or increasing across the 2 edges and the center stitches remain. So that's why we divide heels or heel stitches into 3 portions. So we're going to take that F number of stitches, divide it by 3, and your number may or may not be evenly divisible by 3. Let me show you a few examples of when it will be evenly divisible by 3 and when it won't be. So let's start up here with the E number. So the E, let's suppose again it was 54 stitches. If I divide that by 2 to get the number of stitches for my heel, I'm going to end up with 27 stitches. Now 27 is divisible by 3. If I divide 27 by 3, I'm going to get 9, and there is no remainder. Now let's suppose I had a different number. So let's say I had, my E was 52 stitches. If that were the case, I would have 26 stitches is the number involved in my heel. Now if I divide 26 by 3, I'm going to end up with 8 and a remainder of 2. So that's how you want to get those G and H values. Now last up, we need to figure out the heel height, the way we do that is we're going to take the G number, so the number of times F was divisible by 3, multiply by 2, and then we're going to take into account that row gauge that we had from our initial gauge swatch. So we want to say there's 8.5 rounds in every 1 inch. So we're going to do G times 2 divided by 8.5, and that will give us our J. So our J is the height of the heel. Lastly, from our initial measurements, C was the total height of the sock leg that we wanted. So we're going to do the total height of the sock leg minus the heel length, and that will give us the length we need to work before inserting our heel. So for this portion of the sock, I stopped the ribbing and I actually just work stockinette stitch. So I just knit round after round for the total length up until where the heel begins. So I include the ribbing as I'm measuring down as well. So the ribbing plus this stockinette portion should calculate up to be the total length excluding the heel. Now using the math that we just did, our sock is essentially divided into 3 portions, and we're only dividing 1/2 of the sock, right? So I don't actually need any of these stitches over here on the other side. I'm about to start a new round, and I'm going to be working the whole heel across these stitches right here. So across this first knitting needle, I'm going to be placing my 2 stitch markers to divide the sock into those 3 different portions. So first, I'm going to knit across, and essentially the way it's written out is it breaks it down in the pattern into the 3 different sections. But I'm knitting across until there's 1 stitch remaining before my middle of the round. So I'm going to knit all the way across this knitting needle until there's 1 stitch left. And I'm going to be placing my stitch markers at those locations that we just determined using the math. Now when I have that 1 stitch remaining, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my work, and I don't want to do anything with my knitting needles. I want to leave them exactly as they are. Now I'm going to be working across the inside of the sock, right across the purl side of this first half of the stitches. First, I'm going to make a double stitch, and the way I make a double stitch on the purl side of my work is I'm going to pass the stitch going from my left to right knitting needle. And now I'm going to take that working yarn, I'm going to bring it back behind my knitting needle, and I do pull it fairly tight, then in between to the front again. So I just made a double stitch. Now I'm going to begin purling across until there's 1 stitch remaining before my beginning of the round. Now I have that 1 stitch remaining. So I'm going to turn my work, and now to start the next row, I need to make a double stitch with this first stitch. So I'm going to bring my working yarn to the front first. I'm going to slip that stitch from my left to right knitting needle, and now I'm going to take that working yarn and I'm going to pull it up over to the back. So you can see how we turn that 1 loop kind of into 2 loops there, or a double stitch. Next, what I'm going to do is now I'm going to knit across up until where my previous double stitch is. So you can see kind of both of those strands are hooked on there. So that's my previous double stitch. So I'm going to knit all the way up to and including the stitch before my previous double stitch. So now I just stopped. My next stitch is a double stitch. So I'm going to turn my work. And now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new double stitch. So the way I do this on my purl side is I'm going to slip that stitch from my left to right knitting needle, take my working yarn, pull it up over, back behind, then in between the 2 knitting needles to the front. So now I have 2 double stitches in a row. And now on the inside of my work, I'm going to purl across all the way up until the previous double stitch that I've made. So all the way up until and including that stitch before my previous double stitch. Now that I've reached that double stitch, I'm going to turn my work. And now again on this side, I'm going to make a double stitch. So I bring my working yarn to the front, slip the first stitch from my left to right knitting needle, then pull that stitch up over to the back. So you now have kind of noticed the pattern likely, where we're going to keep on going across up until our previous double stitch, right? So in this case, I'd stop right here, knit that stitch, turn my work, turn that stitch into a double stitch, and now I'd have 3 double stitches in a row. I'm gonna work all the way across up until this stitch next time, turn my work, make this one a double stitch, right? And I'm gonna get narrower and narrower as I keep on going across. And the point at which I wanna stop to show you the center rounds is I'll have finished making all of these stitches over here on my left-hand side, double stitches, all the way up until my stitch marker. And on the right-hand side, I'll be just about to make my final double stitch over here. So at that point, I'll come back and I'll show you the next step where we work the center rows for the heel. I did want to mention too that as I was knitting across after that clip that I just filmed while I was showing you how to create the heel, I noticed that I had dropped a stitch somewhere in this region here. I've now fixed that and picked back up the stitch and knitted with it and carried it back up. So don't make the same mistake as me. No need to drop any stitches in the heel. Now I just worked across my final kind of like right side row, turned my work, made my last double stitch here. So now they're all double stitches except this one over here in the corner. And I'm purling across to make my final double stitch on the other side. So I'm going to purl the stitch just past my stitch marker, turn my work, bring my yarn to the front, slip that stitch from the left to right knitting needle, and then pull it over to the back. So to summarize real quick what I'm looking at, I have the exact same number of double stitches on either side, and on both sides, excluding the middle portion, every stitch is a double stitch except the outermost stitch on each side. So next up we have the center rows. So what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to knit all the way across the center portion. Then I'm going to knit all the way across each one of these double stitches. And each time I'm working one of the double stitches, I'm knitting both of the loops of the double stitch together. And I'm going to keep on going all the way across, and then I'm going to knit the final stitch. So first let me knit across the center portion here. Now for each one of these double stitches, again, I'm going to knit both of the loops together. And I'm going to knit that final stitch that I have never previously made into a double stitch. Now I'm going to turn my work. And the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to make this first stitch into a double stitch. So I'm going to slip it, then pull my working yarn to the back in between my 2 knitting needles to the front again. Now I'm going to purl all the way across the first set of stitches, purl all the way across the center, and then I'm going to purl all the way across each one of my double stitches on the other side. And each time I'm purling one of those double stitches, I'm purling both of the loops together, and I'm going to purl that final stitch. So again, for each one of these double stitches, I'm purling both sides of the double stitch together. And for this final stitch here, I'm also going to purl that, turn my work. And now, first up, I'm going to make a double stitch. So I'm just going to pull my working yarn up over the back in between the two knitting needles. Now next up, we're going to be expanding outwards, right? So the last round, we were basically going narrower and narrower each time. And now we're going to do the opposite. So we're going to go narrow and then expand outwards. So this first row, what I'm going to do is first I'm going to make a double stitch with this first knit stitch. So then I'll have a double stitch on either side. Then I'm going to knit across the right portion, knit across the center portion, and then knit one stitch beyond my second stitch marker. So first up, I'm going to make a double stitch, then knit one stitch beyond my second stitch marker. Knit one. Now I'm going to turn my work. And on this side of my work, I'm going to make a double stitch, then I'm going to purl all the way across the center stitches, and then on the stitch just past my second stitch marker, I'm going to purl it and then stop. So make a double stitch, knit across the center stitches, sorry, purl across. Purl across the center stitches, purl one. Now I'm going to turn my work, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a double stitch. So bring my yarn to the front, slip that stitch, pull it over to the back. Now when I continue this row, what I'm going to do is I'm going to knit all the way across the center stitches, then I'm going to knit my double stitch, and I'm going to knit the two sides of it together, and then I'm going to knit one more stitch. So each time we're going to be expanding outwards one stitch further. So knitting both sides of my double stitch together, knit one, turn my work, and now I'm going to make a double stitch. So I make a double stitch, and then again on this side, now I'm going to purl. I keep on wanting to switch that word. I'm going to purl any stitches before my stitch marker, purl all the way across the center stitches, and then purl my double stitch together, purl one more. So expanding outwards, one more stitch. Purl one more, and now turn my work, make a double stitch. So now you can probably see the pattern that we started to create. We're going to keep on knitting all the way across until our previous double stitch, knit the two sides of the double stitch together, knit one more, then turn our work, right, make a double stitch, purl all the way across, all the way over until wherever our double stitch was, purl the double stitch together, purl one more. And we're going to keep on expanding outwards until we've created double stitches all the way up until and including one stitch before that final double stitch. So when you're all done and you come back for the next step, you should have two double stitches in a row over here on the right hand side, and you should be just about to work your final double stitch all the way over here before the edge one on the back side of your work. So the place where you'll want to stop, where I'll come back and I'll show you the next step, is you want to keep on moving this double stitch over here on the left hand side when you're looking at the outside of your sock over until you've created two double stitches in a row here at the end. So you want to have just finished that double stitch over here, right before that final double stitch. And then on the back side of your work, you'll be just about to work across that final row where you're going to be creating the final double stitch, one stitch in from the last one over here. And once you get to that point, I'll come back and I'll show you how we finish up our heel and start working in the round again. Now I just finished purling all the way across, and the only thing I have left over here on my left-hand knitting needle is my last double stitch. So what I want to do is I want to turn my work, and now before I begin working in the round, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a double stitch. So I'm going to bring my working yarn to the front, pass the stitch to my right knitting needle, and then pull it over to the back. So now when I look at my work, I have 2 double stitches over here on the right hand side. And then on the left hand side, I have 2 double stitches. So once you're at this point, you're all ready to start working in the round again. And how I'm gonna do this is first, I'm gonna knit across and I'm gonna remove my 2 stitch markers as I'm knitting across this first time. Now I'm going to keep on knitting over until my double stitches. And each one of these double stitches I actually want to knit together. So knitting the 2 loops of the double stitch at the same time. Now I'm going to turn my work. And when I turn my work this time, exciting news, we finally get to start working in the round. So I'm going to thread back in my second knitting needle, pull my back knitting needle towards the right, and now start working across the other half of the stitches, which I haven't been working the whole time, with the heel. Now when I turn my work again, I'm just going to thread back in the other knitting needle. And now at the beginning of this round, I do still have those 2 double stitches. So again, I'm going to knit the 2 loops of each one of those double stitches together. Now I'm going to continue knitting round after round, but before we can do that, we need to calculate how far up the foot we should knit before we put in the toe. So first, let's look at the calculation, and then when I come back, I'll have knit all of that stockinette up through where we work those toe decreases. Just like how we had to calculate how long to knit the sock leg before adding in the heel, we also need to calculate how long to knit the foot before adding in the toe. So the first thing we're doing here is we're assuming the toe decreases are going to be exactly 2 inches. And we will actually set them to be 2 inches in the next step. But what you want to do is you want to take A, and A was the foot length all the way up from our original measurements, and we want to multiply that by 0.9. The reason we want to multiply that by 0.9, it essentially goes back to that same idea of negative ease when we were trying to figure out the number of stitches to cast on. You want your sock to be tighter, that way when you start wearing it and it loosens up, it doesn't become too loose. So do A times 0.9, and then you want to subtract off the 2 inches that are going to be used for the toe. Once you've done that, you've ended up with your L measurement. So L is how far you want to keep on working the sock foot in stockinette stitch before we add in the toe decreases. And when you're measuring this L measurement, you want to knit, or you want to measure all the way from the back of the heel, so essentially where you worked those center rows for the heel, all the way up through the base of the knitting needle. And once that reaches L, you'll be all ready to begin the toe decreases. As we mentioned in the previous step, the toe decreases are going to take place over 2 inches. Now, based on our gauge, 2 inches is 17 rounds. We save one of those rounds for the Kitchener stitch at the end, so there's 16 rounds remaining, over which we're going to distribute our toe decreases. Now, the total number of toe decreases you want to work, it should be essentially kind of tied to the size of the heel. So again, with the heel, we had it divided into 3 different sections. We had G on either side, and then in the center, we had the G plus H. So the total number of decrease rounds we're going to work is going to be equal to that G number. Now I have in the pattern included a list of the numbers 1 through 16. And what you want to do is you want to distribute those G decrease rounds over the 16 rounds that are possible. Now, the 1 round, that's essentially where you're starting. And then the 16th round, that will be the last round of your stock. Now, what you typically want to do is you want to start off with slower decreases or more spread out, and then you want the decreases to get faster. It will depend on how many decrease rounds you need to work though. So let's say we had 8 decrease rounds, or G equal to 8. An easy way you can distribute that is you just want to go across and circle every other round, right? And that gives me exactly 8 decrease rounds. But what if instead I had G was 9? Then what I would do instead is I would probably just add in another decrease round there at the end on round 15. That way, right, they start out slower every other round, and then they become faster where it's every round towards the end. If my G was, let's say, 7, then instead what I would do, I'd keep that over there in 16, is maybe I would wait a little bit longer to work my first decrease. So I would actually just knit 1, 2, 3, then start decreasing around 4. There's a lot of different options. You could also switch it if you had a G of 7 to, let's say, I decrease on 3 instead. And then it's basically 2 rounds decrease, 2 rounds decrease, and then it goes 1 round decrease all the way across. You have a lot of options. I do recommend that you write them out and circle which rounds you're choosing to decrease on. That way when you go to work the second sock, it'll be exactly the same. You just want to start out slower and then get faster would be the ideal. Now I've continued knitting that L distance, where if I measure from the back of my heel up until the base of my knitting needle, it's now L in length. And what I'm ready to do now is I'm ready to start adding in my decrease rounds. So I've already followed along with the pattern, and on my iPad here, I've labeled where I'm going to put each one of my decrease rounds. So anywhere I've circled, you could label it differently, is going to be a decrease round. Anyone that isn't circled is going to be just a plain stockinette round. So if you have in yours that you're starting with stockinette rounds, you just want to knit however many rounds that you need up until where we're working the first decrease round. And what a decrease round is going to look like is it's the same pattern repeated on both halves of the stitches, where we knit 1, slip, slip, knit until 3 stitches remain, knit 2 together, knit 1, turn our work, repeat on the other side. So in total, each decrease round, we're decreasing 4 stitches. So to show what one looks like, I'm going to knit the first stitch, then I'm working a slip, slip, knit. So I'm going to slip the first stitch as if I'm knitting it, slip the next stitch as if I'm knitting it from my left to right knitting needle. I didn't actually knit either one of those stitches, I just twisted them. Now I want to take my left knitting needle point and I want to go into the front base of both of those 2 stitches at the same time, wrap my yarn around, pull through, and slide both of those stitches off of the left knitting needle. So what a slip slip knit is it's a left leaning decrease. So I'll show that one more time on the other side. For right now, I'm going to knit until 3 stitches remain on this first knitting needle, or my halfway point. And now that 3 stitches remain, it's going to be a knit 2 together, which is a right leaning decrease. To work a knit 2 together, I'm going to take my right knitting needle point. I'm going to go into the front base of the next 2 stitches, going from the left towards the right. Now I'm going to wrap my yarn around and pull through, slide both of those stitches off. Knit my final stitch. Now it's a full round, so I need to work it on the other side of my work as well. So first I'm going to knit the first stitch, Then work that slip, slip, knit. So I'm going to slip the first stitch as if I'm knitting it from my left to right knitting needle. Slip my next stitch from my left to right knitting needle as if I'm knitting it. And now I want to take my left knitting needle point and slide both of those back over to the left. If you want to, you can leave that right knitting needle in there. If you accidentally take it out, all you need to do is take that right knitting needle point and go into the back of both of those stitches, right, going from right to left at the same time. Wrap your knitting needle around, pull through. Now I'm going to knit until 3 stitches remain. And now I'm going to knit 2 together. So right knitting needle point into the base of the next 2 stitches, growing from the left towards the right, wrap my yarn around, pull through, slide them both off, knit my final stitch. So that was my decrease round. And now in my pattern, I'm going to mark that off, and I'm going to continue working the decrease rounds or the stockinette rounds all the way up through those 16 rounds. Once I'm done with the 16 rounds, I should just have that G plus H number of stitches remaining on each knitting needle. And at that point, I'll be all ready to work that Kitchener stitch for the toe. Last up here, we're going to be working the Kitchener stitch across the top of the toe. So I'm now all done my decreases, and the number of stitches I have left on each knitting needle is equal to that G plus H number. And what I want to do is first I'm going to cut my yarn. So I'm going to cut my yarn leaving about a 12 to 18 inch tail. And all I need in front of me is a tapestry needle. So this is the largest one from the Clover set. I'll link them down below. And the way the Kitchener stitch works is there's 2 setup stitches or movements, and then it's a 4 movement repeat. First thing we need to do is we need to go purlwise through the first stitch on the front knitting needle. And I want to make sure my yarn isn't like draped over or going to wrap around any knitting needles. It starts out down below. Leave that stitch on the knitting needle. And now I want to go knitwise through the first stitch on the back knitting needle. And when I do this, I want to go under my front knitting needle to the back knitting needle, knitwise through that stitch. Leave that stitch on the knitting needle. So those were my 2 setup movements, and now I have the repeat. So now I want to go knitwise through the first stitch on my front knitting needle. And I'm going to now slide that stitch off of my knitting needles. Second is I'm going to go purlwise through the new first stitch on my front knitting needle. Make sure it doesn't wrap around my knitting needles at all. Leave that stitch on the knitting needle. Third step, purlwise through the first stitch on the back knitting needle. Slide that stitch off of the back knitting needle. And now the fourth step is you want to go knitwise through the new first stitch on the back knitting needle. And as I'm going along, I am pulling those stitches fairly tight, just so then that cast off edge ended up with about the same tension as I was knitting my sock. So let me show you the 4 steps one more time. So I'm going to go knitwise through the first stitch on my front knitting needle. And then I'm going to slide that stitch off of my front knitting needle. Now I'm going to go purlwise through the new first stitch on my front knitting needle. As step 2, leave that stitch on my front knitting needle. Third step, purlwise through the first stitch on the back knitting needle. Slide that stitch off of the back knitting needle. Fourth step, knitwise through the new first stitch on the back knitting needle. Leave that stitch on the back knitting needle. And you can kind of see it already starting. It should look just like V's going across this topmost edge. Now I'm going to continue going across the stitches I have here, and I'll show you what happens once I get over here towards the other side and what I do with those final remaining stitches when I can't complete all the steps of the repeat. For now, I'm just going to put the repeat steps up on the screen so you can follow along. So I just finished the repeat step 4, and I only have 2 stitches left, one on my front, one on my back. So all I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna go knitwise through my first stitch on my front knitting needle, slide that stitch off, and then I'm gonna go purlwise through the first stitch, or my only stitch, on the back knitting needle, slide that stitch off. And what I typically do now is I'm gonna thread this end to the inside of my work. Now we've completed one sock, so all that's left to do is repeat all these steps again for the second sock. I hope you enjoyed this knitting tutorial. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them down below. And if you're new to my channel, don't forget to hit that red subscribe button. That way you stay up to date on all my future videos. If you're interested in learning how to knit socks using other weights of yarn and customizing them to perfectly fit your feet, I do have that Skillshare exclusive class that I'll be sure to link in the description box down below.